The dusk settled low over the rail line, painting the horizon in bruised colors, as if the sky itself bore the shame of the forgotten. A woman walked the trackside barefoot, one hand pressed to the swell of her belly, the other clutching a thin shawl against the evening wind. Her name was Evelyn Hart, and though she was young, 22 summers at most, her eyes already carried the weary depth of someone who had been asked too often to endure. Dust clung to her hem like accusation, and every step seemed heavier than the last, though she pressed forward as if the earth might open behind her and swallow her whole. When the lamps of the small town flickered alive, she reached the rail station. A handful of townsfolk turned their faces toward her, eyes narrowing with the sharpness of quick judgment. A widow, and pregnant besides, already her story spread without words. She lowered her gaze, hoping to shrink herself smaller, though the roundness beneath her shawl betrayed all attempts at hiding. She sank onto the station's wooden bench, the planks cold through her thin dress, and tried to breathe as if she belonged anywhere at all. The night air was laced with coal smoke and the metallic tang of iron. A group of women, waiting for a late train, pulled their shawls tighter, whispering with sidelong glances. One man spat onto the boards and muttered, "Another burden come drifting through. Best keep clear." Evelyn felt each murmur strike like a lash, her hands tightening around the fabric at her belly. She remembered, unwillingly, the last night with her husband, a restless gambler whose temper ran hotter than the whiskey he favored. He had promised her a better life, then left her with nothing but debt and a child stirring beneath her ribs. He died in a fight over cards, leaving her stranded between towns, between worlds, carrying both his absence and his legacy. As the whispers grew heavier around her, she wished to vanish. Instead, her body betrayed her, a sudden wave of dizziness bending her forward. She braced herself on the bench, vision dimming at the edges. That was when she felt it, a weightless shadow falling across her, blocking the lamplight. She looked up and met the eyes of a man. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, his coat rough-spun and dusted with the color of earth. His jaw carried a scar that traced like an old road, his face unreadable but steady as stone. He didn't stare at her belly the way others had. His gaze rested only on her face, calm and even. Without a word, he slipped his coat from his shoulders and draped it around her, the fabric still holding the warmth of his body. "You'll freeze out here," he said simply, voice deep, carrying the weight of a man not given to wasting words. Evelyn blinked against sudden tears, though she swallowed them back quickly. Pride, or perhaps fear, kept her silent. She tried to rise, but her legs buckled beneath her. The stranger steadied her with a large, calloused hand at her arm, firm enough to keep her standing yet gentle enough that she did not feel trapped. He guided her across the platform toward the inn on the corner. The innkeeper, a barrel-bellied man with a red face, raised his brows the moment Evelyn crossed the threshold. "We've no rooms for," he began, his gaze flicking to her stomach with disdain. But before he could finish, the stranger placed a silver coin on the counter. "She'll have a room," he said, his voice quiet but immovable, like a fence post sunk deep in the soil. The innkeeper muttered something under his breath, yet swept the coin into his palm all the same and handed over a key. Evelyn felt a burn of humiliation climb her throat. She did not want to be indebted to any man, not after all she had endured. But the stranger did not look at her with pity. Instead, he met her eyes with something closer to recognition, as though he understood too well what it meant to be turned aside by the world. When she reached the narrow staircase, she finally found her voice. "Why?" she asked softly, her fingers clutching the railing. The man paused, studying her for a long moment before answering. "Because no one should be left in the cold." Then he tipped his hat and stepped back into the night, leaving her wrapped in his coat, her heart beating strangely fast. Later, in the thin-walled room above the inn, Evelyn lay awake listening. The whispers of gossip carried up from the tavern below, voices speaking her name, voices attaching shame to it, voices weighing her like coin on a scale. She pressed her palms to her stomach, whispering to the child within, promising that somehow she would find a place for them both. Yet her chest ached with doubt, for where in this land was there room for a woman like her? Through the window, she caught sight of the same man again, standing across the street beneath the lamplight. He leaned against a fence post, hat pulled low, as though uncertain whether to walk away or remain. The sight stirred something unfamiliar in her, not safety exactly, but a flicker of belonging, fragile as a candle flame. The next morning, Evelyn ventured out with a bundle of mended cloth, hoping to find work. At the dressmaker's shop, she offered her services, showing neat stitching on seams. The shopkeeper, a thin woman with pursed lips, looked her over with eyes colder than glass. "I've no need for help," she said curtly, though her gaze lingered disapprovingly on Evelyn's rounded form. Evelyn tried the grocer next, then the laundry house. Each place turned her away. By the time she returned to the inn, her legs trembled and her pride lay scattered like broken crockery. That evening, as she sat in her small room, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, the rancher stood there. She had learned his name from the whispers, Silas Boone. He held a small loaf of bread in one hand, a lantern in the other. Without ceremony, he set them on the table. "You'll need these," he said, his gaze steady. Evelyn's throat tightened. "I don't want charity." "It isn't charity." His voice was low, almost hoarse. "I know what it is to lose everything." And before she could answer, he tipped his hat again and disappeared down the hall. That night, Evelyn dreamed of wide fields and a house where the wind did not howl through cracks, where a child might be born without whispers following it. In the dream, there was always a figure standing near the doorway, silent, steadfast, unyielding. When she woke, the dawn light fell pale across her face, and for the first time since her husband's death, Evelyn felt the faintest stirrings of a question she dared not yet name. For outside, down on the street, Silas Boone leaned once more against the fence post, his shadow long in the rising sun, as if he were waiting for something he himself had not yet decided to claim. The wind that swept the town in late autumn carried with it a chill sharper than knives, curling around doors and seeping through shutters. Evelyn wrapped her shawl tightly as she moved down the main street, her steps small, her body slow with the weight she carried. Shop windows gleamed with bolts of cloth, boots lined in tidy rows, jars of penny candy. Worlds of ordinary comfort closed to her. Each place she had asked for work had turned her away. Too much shame, too much baggage, too much of what no one wanted. She told herself she could withstand hunger, but when her child kicked beneath her ribs, the sting became unbearable. At the end of the street, she heard a sharp laugh. A man staggered out of the saloon, whiskey wet on his chin. He leaned against the wall, blocking her path. His eyes raked over her with a cruel smile. "Well now, look what trouble wandered in. That baby of yours don't even got a name, does it?" His words slithered into the cold air, louder than necessary, meant for every ear nearby. Evelyn froze, shame blooming hot across her face. She clutched her shawl tighter, wishing she could disappear. Before she could answer, another shadow fell. Silas Boone stepped from the edge of the boardwalk, tall and steady, his boots striking the wood with deliberate weight. He said nothing, only fixed the drunk with a gaze that cut deeper than any blade. The man's laughter faltered, his bluster collapsing. He muttered curses under his breath as he stumbled away, leaving the street suddenly quiet. Evelyn's breath trembled in her chest. Silas turned his head toward her, eyes softer now. "You all right?" She nodded quickly, though her lips trembled with what she could not speak. He adjusted the brim of his hat and began to walk away, but then stopped, stooped to inspect the broken latch on her door where the drunk had leaned too hard. Without asking, he knelt, fixed it with a spare nail and his pocket knife, hands practiced and sure. Evelyn watched in silence, her heart pulling in directions she did not understand. "Why do you help me?" she whispered when the work was done. Silas wiped his hand against his coat, hesitated, then looked at her with something stripped bare. "Because no one helped me." The words sank deep, carrying more weight than he intended to reveal. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. She wanted to ask what he meant, what hurt lived behind his silence. But he tipped his hat and stepped back into the gathering dusk before she could. Days passed, each marked by the rhythm of survival. Her slow walks to seek work, the constant gossip that trailed behind her, the kindness that arrived quietly in Silas's gestures. A sack of flour left at her door, boots mended and returned without a word, a lantern lit when hers had burned out. He never asked to come in, never pressed her with questions. His silence was not absence. It was a kind of presence steadier than words. One morning, he asked if she would walk with him to his ranch. She hesitated, knowing the eyes that would follow them, but something in his request carried no demand, only a quiet offering. She agreed. The land stretched wide beyond town, gold grasses bent beneath the wind, the sky a clean blue that seemed to widen with every step. Evelyn felt the earth under her feet loosen the knots inside her. She let her hand brush the wooden rails of the fence, rough and solid. Silas walked beside her, saying little, but once she paused from weariness, he knelt without a word, adjusting her boots so the leather would not rub against her swollen feet. His touch was practical, but in it lived something almost tender, something that left her eyes stinging with tears she pretended the wind had caused. When they returned, whispers already stirred. Women gathered outside the mercantile, their voices sharp. The widow walks his land now, already living like man and wife. The words followed Evelyn like burrs. That night, she packed her small bundle, meaning to slip away before dawn, to spare him the weight of her disgrace. But as she reached the stairwell, Silas was waiting at the bottom, arms folded, as though he had known her heart's intention before she did. "You're leaving," he said quietly. "I won't drag you down with me," she whispered. His eyes met hers, unwavering. "Your child will need a father, and I want a family." The room seemed to still around her, the world narrowing to the shape of his words. She trembled, torn between disbelief and the ache of longing that rose so swiftly she feared it might undo her. "But the child is not yours," she said, the truth bitter as gall on her tone. Silas stepped closer, his presence filling the narrow hall. "Doesn't make it less deserving of a name, or a home." The silence that followed was deeper than any words. Evelyn's heart hammered so loudly she thought it might echo down the stairwell. She wanted to protest, to tell him she was too stained, too broken, but the steadiness of his gaze held her fast, as though he believed something she could not yet believe for herself. By morning, word had spread. At the chapel steps, townsfolk gathered, their eyes sharp as knives. The gossip swirled like dust devils. A rancher proposing to a widow heavy with another man's child. Evelyn walked slowly toward the steps, every whispered word pressing against her spine. For a moment, her courage faltered. She saw herself as they did, shame wrapped in a threadbare shawl. But then Silas's hand reached for hers, large and steady, and she felt the strength of it close around her trembling fingers. He did not lower his eyes, did not hide his choice. He looked straight into the crowd, silent but unflinching, as though daring them to measure his worth against their scorn. A hush rippled through the onlookers, as though dignity itself had fallen like a stone in their midst. Evelyn turned to him, tears spilling down her cheeks, not from sorrow but from the sudden, terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, she was not as alone as she had believed. She gave a small nod, the smallest gesture, yet it carried the weight of surrender, of trust, of a heart choosing to believe in the possibility of home. Together they climbed the chapel steps, not with pride, but with quiet strength, the murmurs of the crowd fading behind them like wind retreating across empty fields. Evelyn felt the child move within her, a kick quick and certain, as though life itself approved of this moment. And as the heavy doors swung open, the lights spilling across the threshold, Evelyn knew the story of her shame had shifted into something else entirely. She did not yet know what name to give it, or what shape the days ahead would take. But she knew this: she was not walking alone. Still, at the back of her mind, fear lingered, fear that love built on such fragile beginnings could be tested by storms yet unseen. And in that uncertainty, her heart both ached and yearned, standing on the edge of a choice that might either save her or undo her completely.